What if I told you that in the early 1700s, a band of cutthroats, fugitives, and runaway sailors carved out their own republic on a tiny Caribbean island, a place where kings had no power, where the law of nations meant nothing, and where freedom came to the point of a cutlass? For a brief, burning moment, these pirates challenged empires, rewrote the rules of the sea, and dreamed of building a nation of outlaws. But could such chaos ever become order? This is the untold story of the pirate republic of Nassau. The dawn of the 18th century was a time of enormous upheaval across Europe and the Atlantic world. The War of the Spanish Succession, which raged from 1701 to 1714, had drawn nearly every major European power into conflict. England, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, each fought for influence, dynastic survival, and territorial control. Battles stretched from the fields of Flanders to the Caribbean, from the Mediterranean to the Americas. When the war finally concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Europe's map had shifted, but the cost was devastating. Armies and navies had swelled to unprecedented size, consuming vast amounts of money and manpower. With peace came demobilization. Navies shrank, armies disbanded, and governments released thousands of men from service. In England alone, thousands of sailors found themselves suddenly unemployed. For many, the Navy had been both a livelihood and a prison. Press gangs had forced countless men into service against their will, where they endured meager rations, harsh discipline, and brutal punishments. When peace ended their conscription, these men were set adrift without pay, without work, and often without prospects. The situation was little better for privateers. During wartime, privateering was a legal and lucrative enterprise. Merchant ships or individuals could apply for letters of marque from their government, granting them license to capture enemy vessels and seize their cargo. Privateers swelled in number during the War of the Spanish Succession, preying on enemy commerce in the Caribbean and beyond. But when the war ended, those letters of marque expired. Overnight, hundreds of ships and their crews lost their legal sanction. They were now faced with a stark choice: return to legitimate trade, often poorly paid, or continue their predatory practices as outlaws. The Caribbean provided both the temptation and the opportunity for such men to continue their seafaring trade in violence. Since the late 15th century, the region had been one of the most contested spaces on Earth. Spain had claimed vast portions of it after Columbus' voyages, establishing colonies from Cuba to Hispaniola, Puerto Rico to the mainland. The riches extracted from the Americas, silver from Mexico and Peru, gold, sugar, tobacco, and dyes, were funneled through the Caribbean en route to Europe. Treasure fleets, guarded by powerful galleons, carried bullion across the Atlantic. To control the Caribbean was to control the arteries of empire. But Spain's monopoly was never absolute. By the 17th century, England, France, and the Dutch Republic had forced their way into the region. Colonies sprouted on islands Spain could not defend: Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Curacao, and many others. The Caribbean became a patchwork of rival powers, each vying for trade, each vulnerable to raids. Smuggling was endemic. Spanish colonies, forbidden from trading with foreigners, often relied on illicit exchanges with English or Dutch merchants. Violence was routine, and shifting alliances during Europe's war spilled into the Caribbean with deadly effect. The geography of the region favored opportunists. Shallow waters, hidden keys, and innumerable islands provided safe haven for those who lived outside imperial law. Hurricanes regularly swept across the region, wrecking ships and scattering survivors onto isolated shores. Even the most powerful navy could not patrol every channel or defend every trade route. For pirates, the Caribbean offered a wealth of targets and places to hide. By 1715, the perfect storm had formed. Thousands of seamen, trained in naval warfare, experienced in boarding ships and handling cannon, were cast adrift by peace. Many harbored resentment against the very governments they had served. They had endured flogging, starvation, and the endless toil of naval life, only to be dismissed without reward. Privateers, accustomed to capturing prizes, were suddenly told their profession was illegal. Yet the skills remained, the hunger remained, and the ships remained. The spark that ignited a new wave of piracy came from disaster. In July 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet of 11 ships, laden with silver from the Americas, was struck by a hurricane off the coast of Florida. All but one were wrecked. The survivors clung to life, while word spread across the Caribbean of the vast riches lying in shallow waters. Spanish salvage crews rushed to recover the treasure, but they were not alone. English privateers, now unemployed, saw opportunity. They swooped down upon the Spanish salvage operations, plundering both survivors and treasure. This incident demonstrated what many seamen already knew. Spain's wealth flowed constantly through vulnerable waters. Treasure fleets, merchant convoys, and coastal settlements offered countless prizes. For those unwilling to return to poverty, piracy was not merely attractive, it was survival. In the years that followed, piracy spread like wildfire. Men who had once served under the Union Jack or the French tricolor now hoisted the black flag. Ships were taken not for king or country, but for the enrichment of the crew. The Caribbean, already a crucible of imperial rivalry, became a hunting ground for outlaws. To understand the scale of the problem, it is important to grasp the conditions of maritime life at the time. The Royal Navy, though powerful, treated sailors harshly. Pay was low, rations consisted of salted meat, hardtack, and foul water, and disease was rampant. Officers enforced discipline with the lash. Death at sea was common, whether from storms, scurvy, or combat. By contrast, pirate crews, though violent, offered certain freedoms rare in the age. Plunder was divided more equally, captains were often elected, and decisions could be put to a vote. To many, this system represented not chaos, but fairness, an inversion of the authoritarian hierarchies it had endured. The growth of piracy alarmed European powers, not only because it threatened commerce, but because it undermined imperial authority. Colonial governors struggled to contain the wave of lawlessness. Many lacked the resources to defend their territories. Some, corrupt or desperate, turned a blind eye, trading with pirates or accepting bribes. The boundaries between legitimate trade, smuggling, privateering, and piracy blurred. The Caribbean of the early 18th century was thus a region in flux. Sugar plantations expanded, enslaved Africans were transported in staggering numbers, and European powers sought to consolidate their empires. At the same time, lawless bands of seamen carved out their own spaces, independent of imperial control. By 1716, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy was underway. Pirates operated across the region, in the Bahamas, off the coast of Cuba, in the Windward Islands, and beyond. Names that would become legendary began to surface. Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, later known as Blackbeard, Charles Vane, and Henry Jennings. Each represented a new breed of outlaw, products of war, shaped by hardship, and unwilling to submit to poverty or authority. The decline of European empires after Utrecht, the unemployment of thousands of sailors, the abundance of targets, and the weakness of colonial defenses all combined to create an environment ripe for piracy. Yet what emerged was not only a wave of plunder, but a question that lingered beneath the violence. Could men cast out by empire form their own order? On the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, that question would soon be put to the test. Nassau, once a minor colonial outpost, became the gathering place for these outlaw crews. From there, they struck at shipping lanes, defied imperial authority, and, for a brief moment, attempted to build a society of their own. The age of plunder had begun, but it carried within it the seeds of something larger. It was more than theft, more than rebellion. It was an experiment, born of desperation, forged in violence, and aimed, however imperfectly, at creating a new form of community. Whether that community could survive, or whether it was doomed from the start, would become one of the great stories of the early 18th century. At the dawn of the 18th century, the Bahamas were little more than scattered islands on the margins of empire. Yet within a few short years, one of them, New Providence Island, would become infamous as a capital of the pirate world. To understand how Nassau rose to prominence, it is necessary to examine its geography, its neglect by colonial powers, and the unique circumstances that transformed it into a haven for lawless men. New Providence is a narrow island, only 21 miles long and 7 miles wide at its broadest point. It lies just 50 miles from the Florida coast, at the very edge of the North American continent, and in close proximity to the busy sea lanes of the Caribbean. To its south lay the rich Spanish colonies of Cuba and Hispaniola. To the north and west stretched the shipping routes to the American mainland and across the Atlantic. Its position alone made it strategically significant, close enough to intercept treasure fleets and merchant vessels, but remote enough to elude swift retaliation. The island's harbor at Nassau, on the northern shore, provided another critical advantage. Protected by a barrier reef, with channels deep enough for smaller vessels but treacherous to the large warships of European navies, it offered a natural defense. Shallow waters, hidden shoals, and labyrinthine channels gave those who knew them an enormous advantage. A frigate or ship of the line risked grounding, while a light sloop or brigantine could slip through unharmed. For pirates, who often relied on fast, maneuverable ships, such geography was invaluable. Nassau's harbor could shelter dozens of vessels, and from it they could scatter across the region at will. Yet geography alone did not make Nassau a pirate stronghold. It was also the product of neglect and abandonment. The Bahamas had first been colonized by the English in the mid-17th century, but attempts at settlement were sporadic and difficult. The islands offered little in the way of profitable agriculture compared to Barbados or Jamaica. They were subject to hurricanes, their soil thin and poor. Spanish forces raided the settlements repeatedly, driving colonists away. By the early 1700s, Nassau was a ghost town. Its fort was crumbling, its defenses non-existent, and its population sparse. This vacuum created opportunity. By 1713, when the War of the Spanish Succession ended, thousands of former privateers and sailors were searching for a base. They needed a harbor where they could refit their ships, divide their plunder, and trade their goods. They needed a place beyond the reach of imperial navies and colonial governors. Nassau, neglected and strategically placed, was a perfect choice. Pirates were not the first outlaws to exploit Nassau's weaknesses. For decades, wreckers, men who scavenged goods from shipwrecks, had made use of the surrounding reefs. Smugglers also found Nassau a useful station, selling contraband to whoever would pay. But after 1715, when the Spanish treasure fleet was wrecked off Florida, the influx of opportunistic raiders transformed Nassau into something larger. Ships laden with plunder sailed into its harbor, taverns filled with drunken crews, and warehouses brimmed with stolen goods. The island quickly gained a reputation as a place where pirates could live openly, without fear of prosecution. It was not merely a hideout. Nassau became the headquarters of what would later be called the Republic of Pirates. This was not a republic in the traditional sense. There was no parliament, no codified constitution, no recognized government. Yet it functioned as a community of equals, bound together by necessity and a shared rejection of imperial authority. The pirate crews who gathered in Nassau brought with them their codes of conduct, developed over decades of seafaring tradition. Each crew had its articles, drawn up and agreed upon by vote. They specified how plunder would be divided, how decisions would be made, and how discipline would be enforced. Captains were elected, and they could be deposed if they failed their crews. Shares of loot were distributed more evenly than in the Navy or merchant service, where officers received a lion's share. Even injuries were compensated. A sailor who lost a limb might receive extra treasure as recompense. When dozens of such crews converged in Nassau, these practices merged into a loose, anarchic order. It was not democracy as understood in London or Paris, but it was a form of self-rule born out of necessity and survival. Decisions were made collectively, disputes settled by agreement or force, and alliances formed between captains. In the absence of colonial law, they created their own. Among the earliest leaders of this makeshift community was Benjamin Hornigold, a former privateer who had turned pirate after the war. Hornigold commanded respect among the crews, not only for his skill but for his pragmatism. Under his loose authority, Nassau became both a sanctuary and a base of operations. Ships captured across the Caribbean were brought to its harbor, their cargoes sold or shared, and their hulls refitted for further raids. The wealth flowing through Nassau was staggering. Spanish silver, English tobacco, French sugar, Dutch goods, all passed through its markets. Merchants, many of them unscrupulous or desperate, flocked to the island to trade with pirates. In exchange for plunder, they offered food, gunpowder, cloth, and luxuries. Colonial governors, though officially opposed to piracy, often tolerated the trade, as it enriched their own economies indirectly. Nassau became a hub not only of piracy, but of a vast black market network stretching from the Caribbean to North America and Europe. The population swelled. By some estimates, more than 1,000 pirates operated out of Nassau at its peak, supported by traders, tavern keepers, and settlers. The town was rough and lawless. Wooden shacks and taverns lined the harbor. At night, bonfires at the beaches, and the sound of revelry carried over the water. Rum flowed freely, songs were sung, and fights erupted in the streets. Yet beneath the chaos lay a sense of belonging for men who had been cast aside by empire. Imperial authorities looked on with alarm. To Britain, Spain, and France, Nassau represented a direct challenge to their power. From its harbor, pirates disrupted trade routes, attacked treasure fleets, and raided settlements. The sheer audacity of their actions embarrassed governments that prided themselves on maritime supremacy. But suppressing Nassau was no easy task. The Royal Navy was stretched thin, its resources devoted to protecting the larger colonies. Warships were slow and ill-suited to navigating the reefs, and colonial officials, far from the centers of power, lacked the means or will to act decisively. Nassau's existence raised troubling questions. Could a group of outlaws, united only by necessity and a desire for plunder, create something resembling a state? Was this anarchic republic a fleeting accident of history, or a serious alternative to imperial rule? Contemporary observers described Nassau as a commonwealth of pirates, a society outside the bounds of law and order. Some even feared it might spread, inspiring rebellion among sailors, slaves, or colonists disillusioned with imperial authority. The Republic of Pirates was fragile from the beginning. It depended on the constant influx of plunder, the cooperation of diverse crews, and the weakness of imperial power. Yet for nearly a decade, Nassau stood as a beating heart of piracy in the Atlantic. From its shores sailed some of the most famous figures of the Golden Age: Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard; Charles Vane, fierce and uncompromising; Calico Jack, flamboyant and reckless; and the legendary women pirates, and Bonny and Mary Red. All would leave their mark on Nassau's turbulent history. But in these early years, Nassau was less about individual legends and more about collective defiance. It was a place where ordinary seamen, disillusioned by war and empire, gathered to seize control of their own fate. It was a laboratory where piracy evolved from a criminal enterprise into a form of governance, however crude. It was a symbol of a world turned upside down, where kings had no power and the black flag flew in defiance of all nations. The lawless haven of Nassau did not last forever. Its very existence guaranteed retaliation from the powers it threatened. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, New Providence Island was more than a pirate hideout. It was a republic of outlaws, a challenge to empire, and the birthplace of legends that would echo for centuries. Piracy in the early 18th century was more than a crime. It was a way of life, governed not by the laws of kings, but by codes written and enforced by the men who lived by them. To the outside world, pirates were outlaws, thieves, and murderers. But within their own ranks, They operated according to a system of rules that challenged the strict hierarchies of European society. This system, often called the Pirate Code, was not merely folklore. It was written down, agreed upon, and enforced by collective will. In Nassau and across the Caribbean, it became the foundation of what came to be known as the Brothers of the Coast. The origins of these codes can be traced back to the buccaneers of the 17th century who roamed the waters of the Spanish Main. These French, English, and Dutch adventurers formed loose alliances to attack Spanish shipping and settlements. They referred to themselves as the Frères de la Côte, the Brothers of the Coast. To maintain order among themselves, they devised agreements known as articles, which specified how plunder would be divided and how disputes would be settled. By the 18th century, these traditions had been inherited and refined by the pirates of Nassau. One of the most remarkable aspects of these codes was their emphasis on equality, at least within the pirate crew, in stark contrast to the Royal Navy or Merchant Service, where captains exercised near absolute authority and sailors endured harsh discipline. Pirate ships operated on principles of consent. Captains were elected by the crew and could be removed by vote if they failed to serve the interests of their men. This system ensured that leadership was based not on birth or privilege, but on ability and trust. A captain's authority was greatest in battle, when swift decisions were necessary, but in matters of navigation, strategy, or punishment, the voice of the crew carried weight. Plunder was divided according to shares that reflected a rough sense of fairness. Ordinary seamen often received one share each, while captains might take 1.5 or 2. Quartermasters, who acted as a check on the captain's power, received a slightly larger share. Even musicians, when present, were allotted compensation. Injuries were accounted for. A sailor who lost an arm or leg was entitled to specific sums of gold or silver, ensuring that those maimed in service were not left destitute. These provisions reveal a system designed to recognize both equality and sacrifice. The contrast with life in the Navy could not have been more stark. A sailor in the Royal Navy might endure years of brutal service under a captain chosen by wealth or political influence. Discipline was maintained through the lash, pay was meager, and rations were poor. Officers enjoyed relative comfort, while common sailors lived on the edge of starvation. Prize money from captured ships was distributed in wildly unequal proportions, with officers reaping most of the reward. In such a system, resentment festered. It is little wonder that many who deserted or turned to piracy embraced the more egalitarian structures of the outlaw world. The pirate code also reflected a desire for order in a profession often associated with chaos. Articles often forbade fighting among the crew, bringing women aboard ship, or gambling with dice and cards. Lights had to be extinguished at night to prevent detection. Loot was to be shared according to agreement, not hoarded in secret. Penalties for breaking these rules could be severe: loss of shares, marooning, or even death. But the fact that such rules existed demonstrates the pirates' recognition that survival depended on discipline and cooperation. To outsiders, this system was shocking. In a world where monarchy and hierarchy were the norm, where kings ruled by divine right and officers commanded by birth, the notion of common men voting for their leaders seemed radical. Some historians have described pirate ships as floating republics, experiments in democracy long before revolutions shook Europe and the Americas. Pirates themselves may not have thought in such lofty terms, but their practices embodied principles that would later be celebrated as ideals of liberty and equality. Yet it would be a mistake to romanticize this world too much. The pirates' democracy existed within a context of violence, plunder, and survival. They were outlaws, living on the margins, pursued by empires determined to destroy them. Their codes were not philosophical manifestos, but practical solutions to the challenges of a dangerous life. Equality within the crew did not extend to those they attacked. Merchant sailors captured at sea might be beaten, robbed, or even killed. Enslaved Africans taken from ships were sometimes freed and joined pirate crews, but others were sold as cargo. The ideal of brotherhood was real, but it was limited. This tension between freedom and brutality between equality and opportunism, lies at the heart of the pirate experience. For many sailors, joining a pirate crew offered a chance to escape oppression and reclaim dignity. They became part of a brotherhood where their voices mattered and their labor was rewarded. But it also bound them to a life of constant danger, hunted by navies, dependent on plunder, and prone to violent ends. The emotional pull of this system cannot be underestimated. Imagine the choice facing a sailor in 1715. On one hand, he could return to the Navy or merchant service, long voyages, poor food, harsh discipline, little pay, and constant risk of disease. On the other, he could join a pirate crew, equal shares of vote and decisions, a captain chosen by merit, and the possibility of great riches. The dangers were real, but so was the appeal of freedom. Nassau became the crucible in which these ideals flourished. There, hundreds of pirates from different backgrounds mingled, traded, and formed alliances. The Republic of Pirates was not a state in the traditional sense, but it was a community built on shared practices. Captains like Benjamin Hornigold and later Edward Teach embodied the authority of elected leaders. Quartermasters enforced the codes. Crews gathered in assemblies to decide their course. In this fragile order, the pirate ideals of democracy and equality found their fullest expression. Contemporary accounts shed light on these practices. The British chronicler Captain Charles Johnson, in his 1724 work A General History of Pirates, described in detail the articles of various crews. One such set, attributed to the notorious pirate Bartholomew Roberts, specified strict rules about gambling, drinking, and distribution of booty. Another outlined compensation for injuries and punishments for theft. While Johnson's work blended fact and embellishment, its consistency with other records suggests that such codes were indeed widespread. The influence of these ideals extended beyond the pirate community. Colonial authorities worried that the example of pirate self-rule might inspire discontent among sailors, slaves, or even poor settlers. The idea that men could live without kings, could govern themselves through consent, was deeply unsettling to empires built on hierarchy and obedience. Pirates may not have set out to challenge the political order of the Atlantic world, but their practices hinted at alternatives that frightened those in power. Still, one must ask, were pirates proto-revolutionaries, or were they simply opportunistic thieves? The truth lies somewhere between. They were not philosophers or visionaries in the mold of later revolutionaries. Their goal was survival and profit, not ideology. Yet in their rejection of hierarchy, in their insistence on equality among themselves, they embodied a form of resistance to the structures of empire. They lived out, in practice, ideas that would later become central to revolutionary thought. The Brotherhood of the Coast was thus a paradox. It was a community of thieves, yet it upheld rules of fairness. It was violent, yet it rejected arbitrary authority. It was anarchic, yet it created order. For the men who lived it, it offered dignity in a world that had denied them. For the powers that opposed it, it was a dangerous challenge to the order of nations. The ideals of the pirate brotherhood were never universally applied, and they were often betrayed by ambition, greed, or desperation. Captains like Charles Vane resisted compromise, leading to bitter disputes. Alliances fractured, crews mutinied, and the Republic of Pirate was torn apart by internal divisions as much as by external pressure. But the fact that such a system existed at all, however briefly, remains extraordinary. In the end, the dream of freedom was inseparable from the brutality of survival. Pirates carved out a space where common men could assert their equality, but they did so through plunder and violence. Their brotherhood was both inspiring and terrifying, a glimpse of what was possible and a reminder of the cost. As Nassau grew in prominence, these ideals spread across the Caribbean, shaping the identity of the Golden Age of Piracy. They made the pirate republic more than a haven for thieves. They made it an experiment in self-rule, however flawed, that continues to fascinate centuries later. By the mid-1710s, Nassau had become more than a haven for wandering seamen. It had become the gathering place of men whose names would soon echo across the Atlantic world. Their faces, their deeds, and their reputations defined the Golden Age of Piracy. Each carried a story shaped by war, hardship, and ambition. Together, they formed a rogue gallery unlike anything the Caribbean had ever seen. The first among them was Benjamin Hornigold, a former privateer. Hornigold had served during the War of the Spanish Succession, harassing French and Spanish shipping under letters of marque. When peace came in 1713, Hornigold, like many others, found himself stripped of legal sanction. But instead of returning to obscurity, he continued his predations, targeting ships from any nation. By 1716, he had established himself as one of Nassau's leading figures. Hornigold commanded a flotilla of small, fast vessels, including the sloop Ranger. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he refused at first to attack English ships, claiming loyalty to the crown. But his crews were less scrupulous, and Hornigold's authority soon waned as men sought more lucrative opportunities. It was under Hornigold's command that another figure first emerged, Edward Teach. Little is known of Teach's early life. Historians believe he may have been born in Bristol, England, around 1680, and served as a privateer in the war. By 1717, he had become Hornigold's protégé, tall, broad-shouldered, and already cultivating an aura of menace. Teach would soon surpass his mentor in notoriety. That year, after seizing a French vessel laden with sugar and wine, Teach took command and renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge. With his heavily armed ship and a growing fleet, he began to make his mark as Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of the age. Blackbeard understood the power of image. He cultivated a terrifying persona, tying slow-burning fuses into his beard and lighting them during battle so that smoke and sparks wreathed his face. His towering frame, wild hair, and bandoliers of pistols gave him the appearance of a demon from the depths. Accounts suggest that he used violence sparingly, preferring intimidation to bloodshed. But the effect was undeniable. Merchant crews often surrendered without a fight, terrified by his reputation. Nassau, already a gathering place for outlaws, gained prestige from Blackbeard's presence. If Blackbeard represented charisma and fear, Charles Vane embodied defiance and ruthlessness. Vane came to prominence in Nassau around 1716. Unlike Hornigold, he showed no hesitation in attacking English shipping. He was violent, unpredictable, and unyielding. His leadership style was authoritarian, and his temper volatile. Yet he attracted followers who admired his ferocity. Vane's refusal to compromise would later bring him into direct conflict with both fellow pirates and imperial forces. He symbolized the uncompromising outlaw, unwilling to bend to authority or accept pardon. Alongside Vane sailed John Rackham, better known as Calico Jack. His nickname came from his flamboyant clothing, made of brightly patterned calico cloth. Rackham was less formidable as a commander than Blackbeard or Vane, but he achieved notoriety for other reasons. It was under his command that two of the most famous women in piracy, and Bonny and Mary Read, would later emerge. Rackham's career was marked by boldness, recklessness, and eventual downfall, but his association with Bonny and Red ensured his place in the annals of pirate legend. And Bonny's story was extraordinary in every respect. Born around 1697, likely in Ireland, she emigrated with her family to the American colonies. Her early life remains murky, but by her teens she had married a small-time sailor, James Bonny, and moved to Nassau. There she encountered Rackham and joined his crew. Defying every convention of the era, and dressed as a man, fought alongside her comrades, and earned a reputation for ferocity. Unlike the countless myths that surrounded women disguised as sailors, and Bonny's presence aboard a pirate ship is well documented. Mary Read's path to piracy was equally remarkable. Born in England around 1685, she spent much of her life disguised as a boy, first to secure an inheritance, later to find work as a soldier. She served in both the army and navy. married a fellow soldier, and briefly attempted domestic life before circumstances drove her back to the sea. By 1718, she had joined Rackham's crew under the alias Mark Reed. Like in Bonny, she fought openly, her identity revealed only after her capture. The presence of two women in a world dominated by men's stunned contemporaries and fueled enduring fascination. Together, Bonny and Red defied both gender norms and imperial authority. Their courage in battle, recorded even by hostile witnesses, underscored the radical nature of the pirate experiment. If Nassau symbolized freedom from empire, their presence symbolized freedom from convention. The rogue gallery was rounded out by other figures whose exploits shaped the era. Henry Jennings, a former privateer, gained notoriety by raiding Spanish salvage operations after the 1715 hurricane wreck. His bold attack near Florida netted enormous treasure and helped ignite the new wave of piracy. Stede Bonnet, known as a gentleman pirate, was an unlikely figure, a wealthy Barbadian planter who abandoned his estate to take up piracy in 1717. Lacking naval experience, he struggled as a commander and eventually fell under Blackbeard's influence. Bonnet's story illustrates the diverse backgrounds of those who joined the pirate ranks. These men and women, drawn together in Nassau, created a volatile mix of ambition, charisma, and conflict. Their reputations grew with every raid, every captured ship, and every skirmish with imperial forces. The Caribbean became their stage, and Nassau their base of operations. To colonial governors, they were criminals whose capture was essential. To ordinary sailors, they were both admired and feared, symbols of resistance against oppressive hierarchies. But the very diversity of this rogue gallery contained the seeds of discord. Hornigold's reluctance to attack English shipping alienated his men, leading to his deposition. Vane's violence and inflexibility clashed with the pragmatism of others. Rackham's flamboyance drew attention but also criticism. Even Blackbeard, with his charisma, could not unite the fractious world of piracy under a single banner. Nassau thrived on cooperation, but it also simmered with rivalry. The arrival of these figures marked the high tide of the pirate republic. Under their leadership, Nassau became the center of a sprawling network of plunder. Their exploits carried them far beyond the Bahamas, into the waters of Virginia, the Carolinas, the Windward Islands, and even as far as West Africa. Their names filled colonial reports, their deeds spread by rumor and fear. What made this rogue gallery so remarkable was not only their individual exploits, but the collective challenge they posed to empire. Together, they represented an alternative order, one based on equality among thieves, freedom from imperial hierarchy, and defiance of law. Their republic was fragile, their lives precarious, but for a brief moment they embodied the dream and the nightmare of a world turned upside down. The rise of these figures also sharpened the central question: were pirates proto-revolutionaries, or simply opportunistic criminals? To the empires they defied, the answer was clear. They were outlaws who disrupted commerce and undermined authority. Yet their practices, electing captains, dividing plunder fairly, living outside the reach of kings, hinted at deeper currents of resistance. Blackbeard's theatrics, Vane's defiance, Rackham's flamboyance, Bonny and Reed's audacity, all contributed to a legend that was more than simple crime. In the streets of Nassau, these figures mingled, plotted, and drank together. Their presence turned the town into a mythic place, a stage on which the great drama of the Golden Age of Piracy played out. Each would meet a violent end, hanged, executed, or cut down in battle. But their names endure because together they defined an era. The Republic of Pirates was never a unified nation. It was a loose alliance of rogues, bound by necessity and shared ideals, but divided by ambition. Yet in the gallery of its leaders, we glimpse the raw power of defiance, the allure of freedom, and the tragic limits of life outside the law. Of all the names who emerged from the Golden Age of Piracy, none looms larger than Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. In life, he was one of many captains who plied the Caribbean and American coasts. In death, he became legend. His image, meticulously crafted during his brief career, has endured for centuries, transforming him from outlaw into myth. To understand Blackbeard is to understand both the reality of piracy and the enduring power of reputation. Little is certain about his early years. Most evidence suggests he was born around 1680 in the English port city of Bristol, a hub of commerce and seafaring. He likely went to sea as a young man, perhaps as a merchant sailor or privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession. Beyond these fragments, his life remains obscure until 1716, when he appeared in the Bahamas under the mentorship of Benjamin Hornigold. It was Hornigold who first gave Teach command of a captured sloop. From that moment, his rise was swift. Teach imposing physical presence, tall, broad, with a thick black beard, set him apart. But it was his ability to cultivate fear that made him extraordinary. He understood that in an age when naval combat was brutal and uncertain, terror could be a weapon as effective as cannon fire. By 1717, Teach had captured a large French merchant vessel carrying wine and sugar. He refitted it into a formidable warship, mounting 40 guns, and christened it Queen Anne's Revenge. With this ship at the center of his fleet, Teach commanded one of the most powerful pirate forces in the Atlantic. His operations stretched from the Caribbean to the American seaboard. Teach's genius lay not only in his seamanship, but in his theatrics. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard and hair, lighting them before battle so that smoke and sparks wreathed his head. With multiple pistols slung across his chest and a cutlass in hand, he presented the image of a devil incarnate. Witnesses reported that his appearance alone was enough to send opponents into panic. This reputation was carefully cultivated. Contrary to later depictions, Blackbeard was not indiscriminately violent. He preferred intimidation to slaughter, knowing that a surrendered ship yielded more profit and less risk than a prolonged fight. One of his most famous exploits occurred in November 1717, when he captured the French slave ship La Concorde off Martinique. Renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, it became his flagship. Reports from survivors describe how Blackbeard's fleet numbered several vessels and hundreds of men. His control over this flotilla allowed him to blockade ports, intercept shipping lanes, and project power across vast distances. In May 1718, Blackbeard staged his most audacious maneuver, the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. For nearly a week, he and his fleet held the entrance to the harbor, seizing ships and terrorizing the colony. The people of Charleston, unprepared and defenseless, were gripped by panic. Blackbeard demanded medicine as ransom, and after negotiations, he released his captives. The episode demonstrated not only his power, but also his ability to manipulate fear and authority. Few pirates had dared such a direct confrontation with an English colony. Yet behind the legend was a man operating in a precarious world. Blackbeard knew that piracy was unsustainable in the long term. By mid-1718, he accepted a royal pardon offered by Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, part of a wider attempt by the Crown to quell piracy by offering amnesty. For a brief time, Teach appeared to retire, settling in Bath, North Carolina. But his respite was short-lived. Reports soon surfaced that he had resumed piracy, using Eden's protection to shield his activities. His relationship with the colonial governor illustrates the blurred lines between outlaw and authority. In exchange for bribes or a share of the profits, officials often tolerated or even aided pirates. Blackbeard's reputation continued to grow, fueled by both fact and rumor. Contemporary newspapers exaggerated his exploits, portraying him as the archetypal pirate. Tales of his cruelty circulated, though many were embellished. Some claimed he shot members of his own crew to enforce discipline. Others said he had wives in several ports. Whether true or not, these stories contributed to the aura of terror that surrounded him. By late 1718, however, his enemies had resolved to end his career. Virginia's Governor Alexander Spotswood, alarmed by Blackbeard's activities along the American coast, authorized an expedition to eliminate him. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy was dispatched with 2 sloops to hunt him down. On November 22nd, 1718, Maynard confronted Blackbeard at Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of North Carolina. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. Blackbeard's men fired broadsides into Maynard's ships, inflicting heavy casualties. But Maynard employed a ruse, keeping many of his men hidden below deck. When Blackbeard boarded Maynard's sloop, expecting to find it crippled, dozens of sailors rushed up to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Accounts of the fight describe Blackbeard as a man possessed. He fought with pistols and cutlass, sustaining multiple wounds but refusing to yield. According to reports, he was shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 before finally collapsing. His head was severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as proof of his death. His body, thrown into the sea, was said by legend to have swum around the ship before sinking, a myth that underscored his near-supernatural reputation. The death of Blackbeard sent shockwaves through the Atlantic world. For colonial authorities, it was a triumph, proof that even the most feared outlaw could be brought down. For sailors and settlers, it was the end of an era. But in death, his legend only grew. Newspapers and pamphlets embellished his exploits, turning him into a symbol of piracy itself. What set Blackbeard apart from his contemporaries was not the scale of his plunder or the length of his career. He was active as a pirate for only about 2 years, but his mastery of image. He understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as cannon fire. By presenting himself as a demonic figure, he ensured that his name would inspire terror long after his death. In the centuries that followed, his legend was retold in countless forms. Writers, dramatists, and later filmmakers transformed him into the archetype of the pirate, ruthless, larger than life, and unforgettable. In reality, Blackbeard was a skilled sailor, a pragmatic leader, and a man who balanced violence with strategy. But the myth of Blackbeard, the smoking beard, the fearsome glare, the bloody demise, ensured his immortality. For the Republic of Pirates, Blackbeard represented both its height and its fragility. His career demonstrated the power pirates could wield, even against colonies and navies. But his death showed how swiftly that power could be extinguished. He was both the symbol of pirate freedom and the warning of its limits. The Republic of Pirates was not built on parchment or proclamations. It was built on the daily lives of men and women who gathered in Nassau, New Providence, during the height of the Golden Age of Piracy. To outsiders, it was a nest of rogues, a den of thieves who defied the laws of nations. But for those who lived there, it was something more, a community shaped by necessity, opportunity, and the shared dream of survival beyond the reach of kings. At its peak, Nassau's population numbered several hundred permanent residents, joined by more than 1,000 pirates who came and went with the tide. The town itself was little more than a cluster of wooden houses and taverns along the harbor, backed by dense forests and shallow creeks. Fort Nassau, built decades earlier by the English, lay in ruins, its guns rusting, its walls crumbling, abandoned by settlers who had fled Spanish raids. Yet in this neglected outpost, the pirates created a bustling center of commerce, camaraderie, and chaos. Life in Nassau revolved around the harbor. Pirate sloops and brigantines anchored close to shore, their black flags furled until needed. Crews came ashore to sell plunder, repair vessels, and rest. The goods they brought in were staggering in variety. Spanish silver from the Americas, sugar and rum from the Caribbean islands, English manufactured goods taken from merchantmen, even exotic items like silk and spices seized from captured traders. These treasures flowed into Nassau's makeshift markets, where merchants, many of them unscrupulous traders from the colonies, exchanged food, weapons, clothing, and luxury items. The economy of Nassau was informal but thriving. Official currencies were scarce. Silver coins from Spain, Dutch guilders, and English pounds mingled with barter and trade in kind. Tavern owners grew rich selling rum, which flowed freely day and night. Weapons and powder, essential to pirate operations, were bought with plundered goods or acquired through smuggling networks that stretched to North America. Some local settlers, far from imperial oversight, became willing collaborators, providing supplies in exchange for pirate treasure. Nassau, once neglected, had become an economic hub, albeit one built on stolen wealth. For the pirates themselves, daily life offered freedoms and dangers unknown in the world they had left behind. On board ship, discipline was enforced by articles agreed upon by the crew. Shares of plunder were divided fairly, with captains receiving little more than ordinary seamen. In Nassau, these practices extended ashore. Captains could not dictate to their men once the spoils were divided. Each crew member, flush with his share, was free to spend as he wished. This created an atmosphere of excess. Contemporary reports describe pirates carousing in Nassau's taverns, gambling with dice and cards, drinking rum by the gallon, and celebrating victories late into the night. Bonfires lit the beaches, music played from fiddles and drums, and men sang sea shanties or brawled in the streets. For sailors who had once endured the harsh discipline of naval life, this liberty was intoxicating. But liberty came at a price. Money vanished quickly in Nassau, squandered on drink, women, and gambling. Pirates who returned to sea often did so penniless, compelled to capture more plunder to sustain their way of life. The cycle of wealth and waste defined the community, ensuring that Nassau thrived only as long as ships were captured. The population was not composed of pirates alone. Nassau attracted a diverse mix of settlers, traders, and even runaway slaves. Escaped Africans found refuge in the community, sometimes joining crews as free men. Some were skilled sailors or craftsmen, valued for their expertise. Others lived in Nassau as part of the settlement itself. Women were present as well, though their roles were less documented. Tavern keepers, wives, and companions supported the pirate economy. The presence of Bonny and Mary Read aboard Calico Jack Rackham's ship was unusual, but not unique in the broader sense of women's involvement in the world of piracy. Nassau, like all ports of its time, was a place of mixing, of races, languages, and cultures drawn together by the lure of opportunity. Religion played little role in the daily life of Nassau's pirates. While many had been raised in Christian households, few observed the rituals of church or Sabbath. The absence of clergy and the rejection of imperial authority created a community where survival, not salvation, was a guiding principle. Still, oaths sworn on the Bible or other sacred objects retained symbolic power in the articles of some crews, showing that religion lingered as a cultural memory even in this lawless enclave. Justice in Nassau was informal, enforced by the collective will of the pirates themselves. Disputes were settled by assemblies of crews or by duels. Theft from a comrade could result in punishment as severe as marooning, a sentence in which the offender was left on a deserted island with minimal supplies. Discipline, though less brutal than in the Navy, was real. Order had to be maintained if the community was to survive. The contrast between Nassau and the world outside was stark. In the Royal Navy, sailors endured meager rations of salted beef, hardtack, and foul water. Punishments included flogging, branding, and execution. Pay was low, and prize money, when awarded, was distributed unevenly, enriching officers at the expense of the crew. By contrast, in Nassau, pirates enjoyed fresh food purchased from merchants, liberty to spend their shares as they pleased, and equality in decision-making. They elected captains, voted on expeditions, and divided loot by agreed rules. To many disillusioned sailors, Nassau represented not anarchy but justice. Still, life in the pirate republic was not idyllic. Disease was rampant, as in all seaports of the age. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery claimed many lives. Injuries from battle or accidents often proved fatal in the absence of surgeons. The threat of imperial retaliation loomed constantly, casting a shadow over the revelry. And while pirates lived as brothers within their community, they were ruthless toward those they plundered. Captured merchant sailors were sometimes beaten, threatened, or forced to join pirate crews. The social experiment of Nassau also carried contradictions. The ideal of equality among pirates did not erase the violence on which their world depended. Freedom for one group often meant suffering for another. Merchants saw their livelihoods destroyed. Settlers lived in fear of raids, and enslaved Africans remained commodities in the wider system, even as some gained liberty among pirates. Nassau's dream of freedom was always entangled with exploitation. Yet for nearly a decade, this community endured. Contemporary accounts by colonial governors and naval officers painted Nassau as a commonwealth of pirates, a society in which no king held sway and every man was free. They viewed it as a dangerous contagion, capable of spreading rebellion among sailors, slaves, and settlers. The very existence of Nassau challenged the authority of empire. In this fragile haven, the daily lives of pirates reveal both the appeal and the limits of their experiment. It was a place where men who had once been whipped and starved on naval ships could raise their voices in assembly, drink to their victories, and spend their plunder without answering to a master. It was also a place of constant danger, fleeting wealth, and the ever-present threat of death. The Republic of Pirates was never built to last. Its foundation lay not in agriculture, trade, or diplomacy, but in plunder. As long as ships could be captured, Nassau thrived. But empires could not allow such defiance to stand. The rhythms of daily life, the rum, the assemblies, the bonfires on the beach, were lived in the shadow of inevitable retribution. For the men and women who experienced it, life in the pirate republic was extraordinary, even if brief. It was a chance to live outside the structures of empire, to seize freedom, however violent or precarious. For historians, it remains one of the most fascinating social experiments of the 18th century, a community forged in defiance, sustained by plunder, and remembered as the beating heart of the Golden Age of Piracy. To the imperial powers that ruled the Atlantic world, Nassau was not just a pirate stronghold. It was an unsettling possibility, a society carved out by men who rejected kings, governors, and navies. The community that grew in the Bahamas raised a profound question. Was this merely a den of thieves? Or was it, however crude, the beginning of a new kind of nation? By the late 1710s, the Republic of Pirates had taken on characteristics that set it apart from a mere hideout. Pirates were not simply passing through Nassau. They were attempting to build a place where their way of life could continue. Ships came and went, but the settlement endured, sustained by trade, informal governance, and a sense of shared identity. To its participants, it offered freedom from hierarchy and a chance to live outside the reach of empire. To outside observers, it was a dangerous experiment in disorder. The idea that Nassau represented a republic, an organized commonwealth, came largely from how pirates conducted their affairs. On individual ships, pirate articles ensured a measure of democracy and fairness. These principles spilled into the community ashore. Captains could not dictate to other captains. Instead, decisions about raids, alliances, and disputes were made in assemblies of crews. Quartermasters, who acted as checks on captains aboard ship, often played leading roles in these gatherings. Authority was diffused, negotiated rather than imposed. Even trade in Nassau reflected this unusual balance. Goods brought in from captured ships were sold or bartered in open markets. Merchants, many of them colonial traders willing to risk the stigma of piracy, operated without fixed tariffs or duties. Prices were set by supply, demand, and negotiation rather than by government decree. It was chaotic, but it worked. Nassau became a hub in a black market economy that connected the Caribbean, North America, and Europe. Colonial officials were alarmed not only by the disruption to commerce, but by the example Nassau provided. If common sailors could live as equals, elect their leaders, and divide spoils fairly, what would stop merchant crews, or even soldiers and colonists, from demanding similar rights? In an age when monarchy was a dominant form of government, the very existence of a functioning community without kings or governors seemed dangerous. The term Republic of Pirates, though meant as an insult, captured a fear that Nassau might become something more permanent. Yet the pirate republic was riddled with contradictions. Its ideals of equality extended only to those within the Brotherhood. Outsiders, merchants, captured sailors, or settlers were prey. The plunder that sustained Nassau came at the expense of countless victims who endured robbery, violence, and sometimes death. To call it a nation is to overlook that it was founded not on production, law, or diplomacy, but on theft. Moreover, unity among pirates was fragile. Captains like Benjamin Hornigold and Charles Vane embodied different visions of piracy. Hornigold, loyal to England, initially refused to attack English ships, while Vane saw no such restrictions. Their disagreements revealed fault lines within the community. Ambition and rivalry often disrupted cooperation. Pirate codes bound individual crews, but there was no overarching authority binding the whole of Nassau. Despite this, the community displayed features that hinted at statehood. Nassau had a population, territory, and a rudimentary form of governance. It engaged in foreign relations of a kind, negotiating with merchants, settlers, and sometimes colonial officials. It possessed a military force in its fleet, capable of blockading ports and challenging navies. For a brief moment, it resembled a microstate, born of defiance and sustained by plunder. But could it have lasted? History suggests not. Without agriculture, legitimate trade, or diplomatic recognition, Nassau's prosperity depended entirely on piracy. The constant need for plunder created instability, ensuring that wealth flowed in cycles of excess and poverty. Imperial powers, though slow to respond, possessed overwhelming resources. Once determined to suppress the pirate republic, Britain and its allies could bring warships, soldiers, and governors to bear. Nassau lacked the means to resist indefinitely. The question of whether pirates were proto-revolutionaries or opportunistic criminals remains contested. Their practices, equality in shares, voting for captains, compensation for the wounded, reflected ideals of fairness rare in the 18th century. These principles prefigured ideas that would later shape revolutions in America and France. Yet pirates did not articulate philosophies of liberty or justice. Their codes were pragmatic, designed to maintain discipline and survival. They challenged empire not through ideology but through necessity. Contemporary observers wrestled with this ambiguity. Some saw in the pirate republic a terrifying glimpse of anarchy, where order collapsed and violence reigned. Others noted the surprising degree of organization and fairness within pirate ranks. The truth lay in between. Nassau was both an experiment in self-rule and a community built on plunder. The dream of a new nation was real for those who lived it. In Nassau, sailors who had endured flogging and starvation in the Royal Navy found equality. Men of different nationalities, races, and backgrounds lived and worked together in ways rare for the time. Freed Africans, escaped slaves, and Europeans shared crews, bound not by empire but by common purpose. This sense of brotherhood, however limited, offered dignity and belonging, yet survival demanded brutality. Pirates relied on intimidation, violence, and theft. Their republic existed only as long as they could take from others. Freedom for the Brotherhood meant fear for everyone else. The very practices that sustained Nassau also ensured that it could never gain legitimacy. No empire could tolerate a rival built on defying its ships, and no state could recognize a republic of thieves. By 1718, Nassau had reached its peak. Hundreds of pirates operated from its harbor, their names feared across the Atlantic. But cracks were showing. Rivalries deepened. Supplies ran short, and imperial resolve hardened. The dream of a new nation was colliding with the reality of empire. Was Nassau truly a republic, a glimpse of democracy at sea? Or was it simply a den of thieves, an anarchic outpost destined to collapse? The answer lies in the paradox of piracy itself. The pirate code offered fairness and equality within the Brotherhood, but it was inseparable from violence and theft. Nassau embodied both the dream of freedom and the limits of survival outside the law. In the years to come, That tension would be tested as the empire struck back. For now, Nassau stood at a crossroads, its fate uncertain, its identity caught between nationhood and outlawry. By 1718, the Republic of Pirates in Nassau had reached its height. Hundreds of men operated from its harbor, their names feared across the Atlantic: Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Calico Jack, and Bonny, Mary Red. Merchant shipping suffered crippling losses, colonies trembled, and European powers fumed. For nearly a decade, Britain had tolerated the situation, distracted by wars in Europe and the Americas. But the age of indulgence was ending. The empire had resolved to strike back. The Crown's response was shaped by two realities. First, piracy had become too costly to ignore. By the late 1710s, estimates suggested that pirates commanded more than 2,000 men across the Atlantic, controlling dozens of ships. They threatened vital trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Sugar, tobacco, and precious metals, all pillars of empire, were vulnerable. Colonial merchants petitioned London for protection, and governors sent desperate reports describing the chaos. Second, the war that had distracted Britain was over. With the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the War of the Spanish Succession had ended, and Britain had emerged with new territories and new ambitions. The empire now turned to consolidating its gains. Secure trade routes were essential. A lawless republic of pirates in the Bahamas was unacceptable. The British government adopted a two-pronged approach: clemency and force. In September 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation offering a pardon to all pirates who surrendered by September of the following year. Known as the King's Pardon, it promised forgiveness of past crimes in exchange for laying down arms. For the Crown, this was a pragmatic step. Piracy was too widespread to suppress by violence alone. Amnesty might fracture the brotherhood, persuading some to return to legality while isolating the defiant. The pardon had mixed results. Some pirates accepted, including Benjamin Hornigold, who retired to Nassau and later assisted British authorities. Others, like Charles Vane, rejected it outright, refusing to abandon their way of life. Blackbeard initially accepted the pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, only to return to piracy shortly afterward. The amnesty sowed division, but it did not destroy Nassau. Real change required force, and for that, Britain turned to Wood Rogers. A former privateer himself, Rogers was a seasoned seaman with a reputation for discipline and resolve. He had circumnavigated the globe in the first decade of the century, captured prizes in the Pacific, and even rescued a castaway Alexander Selkirk, whose story would later inspire Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Rogers understood both the allure and the dangers of piracy. In 1718, the Crown appointed him governor of the Bahamas, tasked with restoring order to Nassau at any cost. Rogers set sail from England with a fleet of warships and soldiers. His mission was clear: enforce the King's pardon, suppress piracy, and rebuild Nassau as a functioning colony. His arrival in the Bahamas marked the beginning of the end for the Republic of Pirates. When Rogers reached Nassau in July 1718, the town was a hive of activity. Pirate ships filled the harbor, taverns buzzed with revelry, and the black flag still flew defiantly. But the sight of Rogers' fleet, well-armed, disciplined, and backed by the authority of the Crown, struck fear. Rogers proclaimed the King's pardon upon landing, offering mercy to those who submitted. Many accepted. Hornigold and his followers joined the governor, pledging loyalty to the Crown. Others hesitated, torn between freedom and survival. Charles Vane's reaction was defiance. Refusing the pardon, he set fire to a captured French ship and used it as a fire ship to break through Rogers' blockade of the harbor. With flames and smoke trailing behind, Vane escaped into open water, signaling his determination to fight on. His flight marked the beginning of open conflict between Rogers and the remaining outlaws. Rogers moved quickly to secure Nassau. He repaired Fort Nassau, re-establishing defenses that had long crumbled. He built up a militia, garrisoned soldiers, and established courts to enforce English law. Pirates who refused a pardon were hunted down, tried, and executed. Gallows were erected as a warning. The days of impunity were over. The sight of bodies hanging at execution docks reminded all who entered the harbor that Nassau was no longer a republic of pirates but a colony of the crown. The transition was not smooth. Nassau had been neglected for decades, and rebuilding its infrastructure was daunting. Rogers faced shortages of supplies, disease, and resistance from those who profited from piracy. Yet his determination was unshakable. He declared his motto Expulsus Pirates, Restituta Commercia, pirates expelled, commerce restored. It became the guiding principle of his governorship. The impact was immediate. With Nassau no longer a safe haven, pirate operations across the Atlantic weakened. Those who had depended on the Bahamian port for supplies and refitting were forced to disperse. Some accepted pardons in other colonies, seeking to return to legality. Others continued their outlawry but found themselves increasingly isolated. Blackbeard's death in November 1718, only months after Rogers' arrival, symbolized a changing tide. Once the terror of the seas, Blackbeard fell to Lieutenant Robert Maynard in a brutal battle off Ocracoke. His severed head, displayed from a Royal Navy ship, was a stark reminder of the Crown's determination. Charles Vane, though initially defiant, soon faced his own downfall. Branded a traitor to the pardon, he continued raiding but was eventually captured, tried in Jamaica, and executed in 1721. Calico Jack Rackham and Bonny and Mary Red were captured in 1720, tried in Spanish Town, and sentenced to death, though Bonny and Reed claimed pleas of the belly, delaying execution due to pregnancy. Reed died in prison. Bonny's fate remains uncertain. By the early 1720s, the great figures of the Republic of Pirates were gone, either dead or disposed. Rogers had succeeded where others had failed. He had reimposed imperial authority on New Providence. Nassau was no longer a republic of rogues, but a British colony once more. Yet the story of the Empire's strike against Nassau is not only one of suppression. It also reveals the fragility of the pirate experiment. Without recognition, without stable governance or economy, Nassau could not withstand the weight of empire. Its dream of freedom, born from desperation and sustained by plunder, was doomed once the Crown resolved to act. Still, the defiance of Nassau lingered in memory. For nearly a decade, it had stood as a challenge to imperial order, a place where ordinary sailors lived as equals and kings held no sway. Rogers may have restored commerce, but he could not erase a legend. The Republic of Pirates remained a symbol of both the dangers of lawlessness and the allure of freedom. The Empire had struck back, decisively and ruthlessly, but in doing so, it ensured that the myth of Nassau would endure, a story retold for centuries as both caution and inspiration. The arrival of Woodes Rogers in Nassau in July 1718 marked the turning point in the history of the Pirate Republic. What had been, for nearly a decade, a thriving outlaw community was suddenly under siege, not only from the power of the British Crown, but from within. The fragile unity that had bound pirates together fractured. Old loyalties were abandoned, ambitions clashed, and the very ideals that had sustained the brotherhood began to unravel. The King's pardon, first proclaimed in 1717 and reinforced by Rogers on his arrival, was a wedge that split the pirate fraternity. For some, it was a lifeline. Men who had grown weary of the constant dangers of outlawry saw in it a chance for survival. For others, it was betrayal, a surrender of freedom in exchange for servitude. In the months that followed, the Republic tore itself apart. Benjamin Hornigold, once one of Nassau's most prominent captains, was among the first to accept the pardon. True to his earlier hesitation to attack English ships, Hornigold returned to loyalty with little resistance. He even agreed to serve as a pirate hunter, turning against former comrades in service of Rogers. For those who remained committed to piracy, his actions were seen as treachery. The man who had once been a founder of the Republic had become an agent of its destruction. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, accepted the pardon briefly in North Carolina, but his motives were suspect. Settling in Bath, he lived under protection of Governor Charles Eden, while continuing to raid ships in nearby waters. His duplicity reflected the ambiguous space between outlaw and authority. Yet his death in November 1718, at the hands of Lieutenant Robert Maynard off Ocracoke Inlet, sent a clear message. No amount of reputation or cunning could shield a pirate from the Empire's determination. Charles Vane, in contrast, rejected compromise outright. When Rogers arrived, Vane staged his dramatic escape by turning a captured French ship into a fireship, blasting through the blockade in a defiant blaze. To Vane, the pardon was an insult. He saw himself as a pirate to the end, unbending, unwilling to yield to crown or governor. But his refusal to compromise also sowed division. Many of his men, exhausted by constant flight and dwindling spoils, abandoned him. His leadership, once unquestioned, fractured under the pressure of survival. John Rackham, Calico Jack, chose a middle path, initially accepting the pardon. He lingered in Nassau, only to return to piracy soon after. His flamboyant style, his partnership with Bonny and Mary Red, and his reckless raids made him famous, but his wavering commitment revealed the instability of the pirate brotherhood in its final years. The community itself was unraveling. Rogers' crackdown in Nassau meant the days of open assemblies, tavern revelry, and free trade were over. Gallows now stood where bonfires once burned. Pardoned men patrolled the streets, some wearing the authority of the crown, others haunted by memories of the brotherhood they had betrayed. Fear replaced camaraderie. Suspicion gnawed at old friendships. Pirate crews that continued to resist were scattered across the Caribbean. They could no longer rely on Nassau as a safe haven. Supplies grew harder to obtain, repairs more difficult, alliances more fragile. The Brotherhood had thrived on cooperation and a shared identity as outlaws. Without Nassau as a unifying base, that identity disintegrated. Crews turned against one another, competing for dwindling prizes. Mutinies multiplied as men sought leaders who could deliver survival. The executions added to the collapse. Rogers and colonial authorities made examples of capture pirates. In Nassau, Jamaica, and the American colonies, trials ended with hangings. Bodies dangled in chains along harbors as grim warnings. These spectacles of justice were meant not only to punish but to terrorize. For the Brotherhood, they were reminders that the tide had turned irreversibly. The once proud Republic now watched its members die one by one, betrayed by comrades, hunted by neighbors, broken by fear. Even those who sought survival through pardon found their dreams curtailed. Some were denied the chance to reintegrate, mistrusted by colonial societies. Others struggled to find work, their past shadowing them. A life of piracy, once embraced with promise of equality and freedom, left few paths for redemption. The fall of the Brotherhood was not only political or military, it was emotional. The sense of belonging that had united desperate men into a community was eroded by betrayal and disillusionment. Pirates had once spoken of themselves as brothers, bound together against the world. Now they found themselves divided, pardon versus defiant, loyal versus outlaw. Trust dissolved. Charles Vane's story epitomized the collapse. After his fiery escape from Nassau, he continued raiding but with diminishing success. His uncompromising defiance alienated even his own crew, who eventually voted him out in favor of Calico Jack. Abandoned, Vane drifted, his power broken. In 1719, he was captured in the Bay of Honduras, taken to Jamaica, and hanged in 1721. His fate showed the price of refusing to bend, even as the brotherhood around him disintegrated. The downfall of Rackham, Bonny, and Red also revealed the fragility of the pirate dream. After a brief resurgence, their sloop was cornered by a British vessel in 1720. Most of the crew surrendered drunkenly without a fight. Only Bonny and Red resisted, fighting ferociously until overwhelmed. Tried in Jamaica, Rackham was executed, while the women claimed pregnancy to delay their deaths. Reed succumbed in prison, while Bonny's fate remains uncertain. Some suggest she was quietly released, others that she died behind bars. Their end symbolized the collapse of the audacious, inclusive spirit that had once defined Nassau. By 1722, the pirate brotherhood that had ruled the Caribbean was shattered. The king's pardon had divided it, Rogers' campaign had crushed it, and imperial justice had destroyed its leaders. What remained were scattered bands, hunted and desperate, no longer able to project power or sustain a community. The fall of the Brotherhood raises a final question. Had it ever truly been united? Nassau's pirates were bound by codes, by ideals of equality, by defiance of empire. But they were also driven by ambition, greed, and survival. Their republic was more fragile than it appeared. Its unity depended on fortune and fate. When empire struck, those fractures widened until the Brotherhood collapsed entirely. For nearly a decade, pirates had carved out a space outside the order of nations. They had lived as equals, challenged empires, and created a republic of their own. But their dream was undermined by its own contradictions. Freedom was purchased through violence, equality was confined to the Brotherhood, and survival demanded betrayal. In the end, the Brotherhood fell not only to the might of empire, but to the weakness within itself. The gallows stood where their taverns had once roared. The king's pardon lay where their codes had bound them, and the black flags were lowered forever. The Republic of Pirates was gone, its brotherhood broken, but its legend would outlive them all. If Blackbeard was a master of reputation and Hornigold a pragmatist, then Charles Vane was the uncompromising rebel of the pirate age. Fierce, ruthless, and unwilling to bend, Vane represented the spirit of piracy at its most defiant. His story did not end in triumph. It ended in betrayal, capture, and the gallows. Yet in his downfall lies one of the clearest portraits of how the Republic of Pirates came to an end. Little is known of Vane's early life. He was likely born in England around 1680 and came of age as a seaman during the War of the Spanish Succession. By 1716, he had surfaced in Nassau, commanding pirate crews in the Bahamas. Unlike Hornigold, Vane showed no hesitation in attacking English ships. His allegiance was not to king or country, but to plunder. This uncompromising stance set him apart in Nassau, where some captains hesitated to provoke the Royal Navy directly. Vane's rise was swift. By 1717, he commanded a sloop with a loyal crew and built a reputation for ferocity. When King George I offered his pardon to pirates in 1717, Vane was among those who scoffed at it. To him, the pardon was an insult, a demand to surrender the freedom pirates had fought to seize. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau the following year to impose imperial rule, Vane staged one of the most daring acts of defiance in pirate history. As Rogers' fleet blockaded Nassau harbor in July 1718, Vane captured a French ship, loaded it with combustible material, set it ablaze, and steered it toward the blockade. The makeshift fireship exploded in smoke and flame, scattering the Royal Navy vessels long enough for Vane and his crew to escape into open water. It was a gesture of both defiance and desperation, a refusal to submit even in the face of overwhelming force. From that moment, Vane's fate was sealed. Branded an enemy of the crown, he was pursued relentlessly. Yet for a time, he continued his raid with brutal effectiveness. His flagship, the Ranger, was fast and heavily armed. He plundered ships in the Bahamas, along the American coast, and as far south as the Windward Islands. His tactics were violent, his treatment of prisoners harsh. While Blackbeard cultivated fear through image, Vane wielded terror through action. But his uncompromising nature proved his undoing. In late 1718, Vane encountered a French warship off the Bahamas. His crew expected him to fight, but Vane, judging the enemy too strong, ordered retreat. The decision enraged his men, who saw it as cowardice. In the egalitarian world of pirate governance, A captain's authority rested on consent. Vane's refusal to engage cost him his command. Led by John Rackham, Calico Jack, Vane's crew voted to depose him. Stripped of his ship and authority, Vane was cast adrift with a handful of loyalists. It was a stunning reversal. The man who had once defied the Royal Navy was now a fugitive among his own kind. His deposition underscored the fragility of pirate leadership. Authority was not permanent, but conditional on victory and courage. For the next year, Vane operated on the margins. With a small crew and minor vessels, he continued raiding but without the power he had once commanded. His legend dimmed, and his influence waned. The brotherhood that had once sustained him was disintegrating. Rogers' crackdown in Nassau, the relentless pursuit of naval forces, and the lure of pardons fractured the pirate world. Vane's defiance seemed increasingly futile. In 1719, fate turned against him completely. A hurricane struck off the coast of the Bay of Honduras, wrecking his ship and leaving him stranded on a small island with only a few survivors. For weeks, they endured hunger, isolation, and despair. At last, they were rescued, not by allies, but by former comrades turned enemies. Among those who discovered Vane was Captain Holford, once a fellow pirate, who now refused to offer aid. To Holford and others who had accepted the pardon, Vane was a liability, a man too defiant to survive in the new order. Eventually, Vane was captured and taken to Jamaica. There, colonial authorities wasted no time in bringing him to trial. He was charged with piracy, and unlike some others, he had no allies in high places to plead for mercy. His reputation for ruthlessness and his defiance of the king's pardon sealed his fate. In March 1721, Charles Vane was hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal. His body was displayed in chains as a warning to others. For the Empire, his execution was a victory, proof that even the most defiant pirate could be broken. For the Brotherhood, it was the end of one of their most uncompromising figures. Vane's story reflects the paradox of piracy's final years. His refusal to compromise embodied the spirit of outlaw freedom, but it also doomed him. While others bent, betrayed, or sought survival through pardons, Vane chose only defiance. His downfall illustrates not only the might of empire, but the fragility of the pirate dream when stripped of unity, resources, and haven. The image of Vane, fierce, ruthless, unyielding, remains one of the most striking in the history of piracy. Unlike Blackbeard, he did not cultivate myth through theatrics, nor did he inspire loyalty through charisma. He embodied instead the raw, brutal side of outlaw life, survival at any cost, rebellion without compromise. His end, on the gallows in Jamaica, marked not just the fall of one man, but the collapse of a vision of piracy that could not bend to empire. The last stand of Charles Vane was less a battle than a refusal. He would not take the pardon, he would not bow, he would not yield. In that refusal lay both his strength and his destruction. He died as he lived, defiant, unrepentant, and unwilling to surrender. Among the many stories to emerge from the pirate republic, none has fascinated posterity more than those of Bonny and Mary Red. At a time when the sea was almost exclusively the domain of men, these two women broke every convention, fought alongside their comrades, and carved their names into the history of piracy. Their lives, as extraordinary as they were brief, reveal both the inclusivity and the brutality of the outlaw world. And Bonny was born around 1697, likely in Kinsale, Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of lawyer William Cormac and his maid. To avoid scandal, Cormac moved with Anne and her mother to the American colonies, settling in South Carolina. There, and grew up with a fiery reputation. Accounts from later chroniclers describe her as strong-willed, quick-tempered, and unafraid of confrontation. She married a poor sailor, James Bonny, against her father's wishes, and followed him to New Providence Island, where James sought work as an informer for Governor Wood Rogers. In Nassau, Anne's life changed. Immersed in a world of pirates, she abandoned her husband and fell in with John Calico Jack Rackham, beginning the partnership that would define her fate. Mary Read's story was different but equally remarkable. Born in England around 1685, she was the illegitimate child of a widow who disguised her as a boy to continue receiving support intended for an older, deceased son. Raised under this deception, Mary grew accustomed to life as a man. As Mark read, she found employment as a soldier in the British Army and later as a sailor. She married a fellow soldier and attempted to settle into domestic life, but his death left her adrift. Eventually, she returned to see disguise once more as a man. By the late 1710s, Mary had joined pirate ranks, sailing under Rackham's command. The meeting of Bonny and Mary Read aboard Rackham's ship was one of history's most improbable convergences. Both lived disguised as men at times. Both had rejected the limited roles offered to women in their societies, and both found in piracy a space, however brutal, where courage and skill mattered more than gender. Together, they shattered expectations, fighting openly and ferociously alongside their male comrades. Contemporary accounts, most notably in Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, 1724, provide vivid descriptions of their exploits. Johnson, who blended fact with embellishment, nonetheless based his work on trial records and testimonies. He recorded that and Mary dressed as men during battle, wielded cutlasses and pistols, and fought with an intensity that astonished even hardened sailors. When crews faltered or hid below deck, the women reportedly stood firm, firing muskets and cursing their comrades to shame them back into the fight. Their presence aboard Rackham's sloop was more than novelty. It symbolized the radical possibilities of the pirate world. In an age when women were largely confined to domestic roles, Bonny and Red asserted themselves as equals in one of the most dangerous professions imaginable. Among pirates, ability and loyalty often outweighed background. Though there were exceptions, their acceptance into Rackham's crew showed how the Republic of Pirates could bend social norms in ways unthinkable in European society. Yet their story was inseparable from Rackham himself. Calico Jack, flamboyant and reckless, was less formidable than Blackbeard or Vane, but his partnership with Bonny ensured his place in legend. Together, the trio roamed the Caribbean in 1719 and 1720, seizing small merchant vessels and living off plunder. Their raids were not on the scale of earlier pirate giants, but their notoriety grew rapidly, amplified by the extraordinary presence of two women in their ranks. The downfall came swiftly. In October 1720, Rackham's sloop was cornered off the coast of Jamaica by a vessel commanded by pirate hunter Captain Jonathan Barnett. Most of Rackham's crew were reportedly drunk and offered little resistance. But Bonny and Mary Read fought ferociously, holding off Barnett's men until overwhelmed. According to testimony, they cursed their crewmates of cowardice, fighting to the last with pistols and cutlasses. Their resistance became the stuff of legend, reinforcing their image as women who defied every expectation. Captured, the crew was taken to Spanish town, Jamaica, where they faced trial for piracy. The proceedings, preserved in surviving records, provide rare direct insight into their lives. Rackham and his male crew were swiftly condemned to death. Rackham was hanged in November 1720, his body displayed in chains as a warning. For Bonny and Mary Read, the trial produced one final twist. Both women claimed they were pregnant. Under English law, known as pleading the belly, pregnant women could not be executed until after childbirth. The court accepted their pleas, delaying their sentences. What followed diverged. Mary Read died in prison in 1721, likely from fever or complications of childbirth. And Bonny, however, disappeared from the record. Some speculate that her father used influence or wealth to secure her release. Others believe she may have lived quietly in the colonies, her extraordinary past hidden. The truth remains unknown. Their legacy, however, was secured. The presence of Bonny and Mary Read in the pirate world fascinated contemporaries and continues to intrigue historians. They embodied both the inclusivity and the brutality of piracy. Inclusivity, because they fought as equals among men. Brutality, because their lives were bound to violence, plunder, and death. Their defiance was personal as much as political, a rejection of the roles imposed upon them by society, seized in the only world that offered freedom, the outlaw republic of the sea. The story of Bonny and Red also illuminates the contradictions of Nassau and the pirate brotherhood. On the one hand, it was a world of remarkable fluidity, where women could fight alongside men, and where race and background were less rigid than in colonial society. On the other, it was sustained by violence and exploitation, with little room for permanence or stability. Their brief careers underscore both the radical possibilities and the inevitable fragility of piracy. In later centuries, and Bonny and Mary Read became symbols. Romanticized in novels, plays, and films, they were transformed into figures of rebellion and independence, often divorced from the harsh realities of their lives. Yet even stripped of legend, their defiance remained striking. In an age of rigid hierarchies, they lived and died as outlaws who refused to conform. Their trial record preserved a final, haunting glimpse of their defiance. When Bonny was allowed to visit Rackham before his execution, she reportedly told him, "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Whether her words were accurately recorded or embellished, they capture the spirit that defined her life, fearless, uncompromising, unwilling to accept weakness. And Bonny and Mary Read did not create the pirate republic, nor did they save it. But in their brief, defiant careers, they embodied its most radical promise. The idea that anyone, regardless of birth or gender, could claim equality through courage and will. Their legend endures because it speaks not only to piracy but to the universal struggle for freedom in a world that denied it. By the autumn of 1718, the Golden Age of Piracy was already faltering. The King's pardon had divided the Brotherhood, Woodes Rogers had retaken Nassau, and the Royal Navy was hunting relentlessly. Yet one man remained larger than life, a figure whose very name carried a weight of terror, Edward Teach, known to the world as Blackbeard. His death would mark not just the end of career, but the symbolic end of an era. After accepting the royal pardon in Bath, North Carolina, earlier that year, Teach had appeared to retire. Governor Charles Eden, sympathetic or perhaps corrupt, extended him protection. Teach even married, whether formally or in name only remains unclear, and briefly lived ashore. But his retirement was short-lived. Soon reports circulated of raids continuing under his command. Merchant ships were plundered, and suspicions grew that Eden was turning a blind eye. To authorities in Virginia, Blackbeard's presence so close to their coastlines was intolerable. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, resolved to act. Determined to crush piracy decisively, he bypassed North Carolina's more lenient officials and authorized a direct strike. In November 1718, he dispatched Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy with 2 armed sloops, the Ranger and the Jane. Their mission was clear: hunt down and kill Edward Teach. Maynard's force numbered around 60 men, well-trained, but outnumbered. Blackbeard commanded a smaller crew than in his prime, perhaps 40 or 50 men aboard his sloop, the Adventure. Yet his reputation made him formidable. He had outwitted governors, blockaded Charleston, and survived countless battles. The coming clash was as much psychological as military. On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, Maynard found Blackbeard anchored at Ocracoke Inlet, a narrow channel off the coast of North Carolina. The pirate ships were visible in the mist, their black flags furled but their guns ready. Maynard ordered his men to prepare for battle. What followed would become one of the most dramatic encounters in the history of piracy. Blackbeard fired first. His cannon roared, blasting into Maynard's sloops. The Ranger was crippled, its deck strewn with the dead and wounded. The Jane, Maynard's flagship, took heavy damage as well. The pirates cheered, convinced they had the upper hand. But Maynard had anticipated the assault. He ordered most of his men to hide below deck, leaving only a handful visible on the blooded deck. From Blackbeard's perspective, it appeared that Maynard's crew was nearly destroyed. Seeing weakness, Blackbeard decided to finish the fight. He boarded the Jane, leading his men in a furious assault. As he and his pirates leapt onto the deck, Maynard gave the signal. Dozens of sailors surged from below, armed with pistols, swords, and cutlasses. The trap was sprung. The battle that followed was brutal in close quarters. Smoke and chaos filled the air as men clashed hand to hand. Witnesses later testified that Blackbeard fought like a man possessed. He fired pistols, swung his cutlass with ferocity, and seemed impervious to pain. Maynard himself engaged the pirate captain directly, and though the details vary, accounts agree that Teach sustained multiple wounds before falling. One report stated that Blackbeard was shot 5 times and stabbed at least 20 before collapsing. Even then, he fought on until blood loss overcame him. His final words are unknown. No defiant speech survives, only the testimony of those who marveled at his endurance. When he finally fell, his body was cast into the sea. To ensure proof of victory, Maynard severed Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his ship. The grisly trophy was carried back to Virginia, displayed as a warning to all who still dared piracy. His head remained on display for months, while his body, according to local legend, swam around the ship 3 times before sinking. Though apocryphal, the story reflected the awe that Blackbeard inspired, even in death. The battle at Ocracoke was more than the fall of one man. It was a symbolic death of the pirate republic itself. Blackbeard had been the most feared and charismatic figure of the era, the living embodiment of piracy's challenge to empire. His defeat demonstrated that the crown could and would strike even the most notorious outlaw. The Republic's defiance was finished. In the aftermath, Blackbeard's legend only grew. Newspapers and pamphlets sensationalized his exploits, exaggerating his cruelty and ferocity. Some claimed he had wives in every port, others that he drank rum mixed with gunpowder before battle. His theatrics, the burning fuses in his beard, the arsenal of pistols slung across his chest, cemented his place in myth. Though his active career as a pirate had lasted barely 2 years, his name became synonymous with the Golden Age of Piracy itself. For Virginia and the Crown, the victory was decisive. The removal of Blackbeard eliminated a major threat to commerce along the American coast. For the remnants of the pirate brotherhood, it was a crushing blow. If even Edward Teach, with his fearsome reputation and loyal crew, could be brought down, what hope remained for others? The death of Blackbeard also underscored the transformation of Nassau and the wider Caribbean. The era of pirate havens was ending. Woodes Rogers' governorship, coupled with a relentless pursuit by colonial navies, ensured that the Republic could not endure. Within a few years, most of its leaders will be captured or executed. Yet Blackbeard's story remains unparalleled. His mastery of image, his blend of intimidation and pragmatism, and his theatrical death at Ocracoke have kept his name alive for 3 centuries. He was not the most successful pirate in terms of wealth, nor the longest lived, but he understood better than any other the power of fear. In life, it won him victories without bloodshed. In death, it made him immortal. The end of Edward Teach was the end of the age's great terror. The man who had blockaded Charleston, who had terrified colonies, who had seen more legend than flesh, now hung lifeless from his ship's bowsprit. His death was a message to all. The Empire had returned, and the Republic of Pirates was no more. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718, he carried more than the authority of a crown-appointed governor. He carried the weight of empire. His task was not simply to govern a small island in the Bahamas, but to crush the pirate republic that had embarrassed Britain, disrupted its trade, and threatened its global ambitions. His mission would be brutal, unyielding, and transformative. Rogers was not a career bureaucrat. He was a seasoned privateer, a man of the sea who understood both the discipline of naval command and the lure of plunder. A decade earlier, he had circumnavigated the globe in command of the Duke, capturing Spanish prizes and rescuing the castaway Alexander Selkirk, whose story would later inspire Robinson Crusoe. Rogers had faced mutinies, storms, and battles, Now he was tasked with facing an entire outlaw community. His motto, adopted as a guiding principle of his governorship, was blunt: expulsus pirates, restituta commercia, pirates expelled, commerce restored. It would define his rule. Securing Nassau. Upon his arrival, Rogers moved quickly to impose order. Nassau, long a ruinous sprawl of taverns, huts, and wrecked fortifications, became his headquarters. Fort Nassau, neglected and crumbling, was refortified. Cannon were mounted, walls repaired, and soldiers stationed to defend the harbor. A militia was raised from pardoned pirates, loyal settlers, and newly arrived colonists. Rogers knew that without strong defenses, Nassau would slip back into lawlessness. He also understood the importance of symbols. Gallows were erected at the waterfront, visible to every ship entering the bay. Pirates who refused the king's pardon were hunted, captured, and hanged. Their bodies, left in chains to rot under the Caribbean sun, served as constant reminders the days of impunity were over. Where once the black flag had flown, now the Union Jack rose over Nassau, the pardons and the hunters. The king's pardon had been designed to fracture the pirate brotherhood, and Rogers enforced it ruthlessly. Those who accepted the pardon were allowed to remain, though under strict watch. Many of them, including Benjamin Hornigold, were pressed into service as pirate hunters. The irony was stark. Men who had once led raids now sailed under crown, pursuing their former comrades. Hornigold, once reluctant to attack English ships, proved an effective enforcer of Rogers' rule. He and other pardoned captains knew pirate tactics intimately and used that knowledge to corner and capture outlaws still at large. The betrayal cut deep. To die at the hands of former brothers was a bitter end for many. But for Rogers, this was precisely the point. The Republic would be destroyed from within as well as without, crushing resistance. Defiance did not vanish overnight. Charles Vane escaped Nassau in flames, and Calico Jack Rackham briefly returned to piracy with Bonny and Mary Red at his side. Blackbeard accepted a pardon in North Carolina, but resumed raids until he was hunted down and killed. Scattered bands of pirates lingered across the Caribbean, from Cuba to the Bay of Honduras. Rogers pursued them with relentless determination. His administration coordinated with the Royal Navy and colonial governors, ensuring that fugitives found no refuge. Captured pirates faced swift trials and execution. By 1720, Rackham, Bonny, and Red were captured and brought to Spanish Town, Jamaica, where Rackham was executed. In 1721, Charles Vane followed him to the gallows. Piece by piece, the Republic's leaders fell. The burden of governance. Yet Rogers' iron rule was not without cost. Rebuilding Nassau drained resources. The colony was impoverished, its economy reliant on precarious trade and subsidy from London. Disease ravaged the population. Rogers himself fell ill, nearly dying of fever in 1719. Supplies ran short, and appeals to England for support often went unanswered. Rogers resorted to harsh measures. He imposed taxes, seized ships for the colony's use, and demanded labor from settlers. His determination to maintain order sometimes bordered on authoritarianism, alienating colonists who had once welcomed his arrival. The dream of a thriving, lawful Nassau clashed with the realities of disease, scarcity, and resentment. By 1721, Rogers was recalled to England, his health broken and his finances ruined. Though his governorship had succeeded in destroying the pirate republic, he was left bankrupt, imprisoned for debt upon his return. His achievement, restoring imperial authority in the Bahamas, was celebrated, but his personal sacrifices went largely unrewarded. The return of Rogers. Yet Rogers' story did not end there. In 1729, he returned to the Bahamas for a second term as governor, restored to favor by the crown. This time, his rule was less dramatic but more stable. The age of piracy was over. Nassau had become a struggling but loyal British colony. Rogers focused on consolidating trade, improving defenses, and ensuring that piracy never again gained a foothold. When he died in Nassau in 1732, the colony mourned him. Though his methods had been harsh, he was remembered as a man who had expelled the pirates and secured the Bahamas for the crown. His grave, overlooking the harbor once filled with pirate sloops, became a symbol of the transformation he had wrought. Legacy of Iron Rule. Woodes Rogers' governorship was both the death knell of the Republic of Pirates and the beginning of the Bahamas as a functioning British colony. His Iron Rule demonstrated that empires, once determined, could crush outlaw communities no matter how defiant. But it also revealed the cost of empire, the strain on individuals, the sacrifices of those tasked with enforcing order, and the relentless cycle of rebellion and suppression that defined the Atlantic world. For the pirates, Rogers represented the end of their dream. His gallows erased their codes, his militias destroyed their brotherhood, and his administration restored the very order they had rejected. For the crown, he was a savior of commerce, the man who had turned a den of thieves into a colony of law. The transformation of Nassau under Woodes Rogers was more than the defeat of piracy. It was a reassertion of empire at a moment when Britain sought to tighten its grip on the Atlantic. The Republic of Pirates had been an audacious experiment in freedom. Rogers' Iron Rule ensured it remained a brief one. The Pirate Republic at Nassau lasted less than a decade. In the sweep of history, it was little more than a flicker, a brief, chaotic interlude in the long march of empire. And yet, that flicker burned brightly enough to leave behind legends, questions, and contradictions that still echo 3 centuries later. Was Nassau truly a nation in the making, or was it only ever a den of thieves? The answer lies somewhere in the uneasy middle ground, in the tension between ideals and reality, freedom versus violence. To the men and women who gathered in New Providence after the War of the Spanish Succession, the Republic represented freedom. They had escaped the brutal hierarchies of European navies, where flogging and starvation were routine, and officers grew rich while common sailors suffered. In Nassau, they elected their captains, shared plunder equally, and held assemblies where every voice mattered. It was, in its rawest form, a society built on consent rather than command. But that freedom rested on violence. The wealth that sustained Nassau came not from trade, agriculture, or diplomacy, but from theft at sea. Merchantmen were plundered, their crews beaten or pressed into service. Colonists and planters lived in fear of raids. Freedom for pirates meant fear for others. The Republic's liberty was inseparable from its brutality, equality versus greed. Within pirate crews, equality was real. Articles of agreement guaranteed fair shares, compensation for wounds, and limits on captain's power. Men of different races and nationalities worked side by side, bound not by empire but by necessity. Freed Africans served as sailors and gunners, Europeans as carpenters and helmsmen. Women like in Bonny and Mary Read fought as equals in an age when most women were excluded from public life. For a brief moment, Nassau embodied a vision of social fluidity almost unheard of in the 18th century. Yet equality was undermined by greed. Plunder flowed into Nassau in waves, creating cycles of excess and poverty. Pirates squandered fortunes on rum, gambling, and revelry, only to set sail again in desperate need of more. Rivalries erupted between captains, alliances fractured, and ambition often outweighed brotherhood. The same men who voted for fairness also betrayed, deserted, and mutinied when it served their interests. Nassau's dream of equality was real but fragile, always on the brink of collapse. The republic that never was. To call Nassau a republic is both accurate and misleading. It lacked the institutions of a true state, no permanent government, no recognized authority, no stable economy. And yet it had a population, a territory, and a shared system of rules. It was not anarchy, it was order of a different kind, forged in opposition to empire. But without legitimacy or sustainability, the Republic could not endure. Its foundations, plunder, rebellion, and defiance, were too fragile to withstand the might of imperial navies. The same contradictions that gave it life also ensured its death. Freedom was bound to violence, equality to greed, brotherhood to betrayal, the emotional arc, and still the dream mattered. For the sailors who had endured chains, whips, and hunger, Nassau was more than a hideout. It was proof that life could be different. They had lived, however briefly, in a world where no king held sway, where every man had a voice, and where defiance created community. That dream could not survive, but it could inspire. When Woodes Rogers arrived in 1718, the gallows rose where taverns once roared, and the Union Jack replaced the black flag. The Republic died not in one battle, but in a slow unraveling, through pardons, betrayals, executions, and the weight of empire. By the mid-1720s, the black flag had vanished from the Caribbean. The dream of a pirate nation was gone. Yet the legacy endured in taverns, in broadsheets, and later in books and plays. The story of the pirate republic was retold. Outlaws who dared to imagine a new order became figures of legend. Their contradictions faded in memory, their failures overshadowed by their audacity. The republic that never truly was became a republic of the imagination. Closing. The pirate republic of Nassau was not a nation, but it was more than a myth. It was an experiment born of desperation, sustained by defiance, and destroyed by its own contradictions. It offered a glimpse, however fleeting, of what life could be outside the rigid structures of empire. It was a dream that died, freedom without order, equality without stability, brotherhood without mercy. But in its death, it gave rise to a legend that outlived every gallows, every governor, and every empire it defied. The pirate republic of Nassau vanished by the mid-1720s, extinguished by gallows, pardons, and the overwhelming force of empire. Yet in death, it achieved something that no amount of plunder could secure: immortality. The republic lived on in memory, in legend, and in imagination. Its legacy was not political power or nationhood, but a myth that resonated far beyond the Caribbean, echoing through centuries of revolutionary thought, democratic ideals, and popular culture. Myths and cultural echoes. From the very beginning, pirate became larger than life. Newspapers in London and Boston sensationalized their deeds, blending fact and rumor into stories that fascinated readers. Pamphlets and broadsides detailed the last words of condemned pirates, often portraying them as cautionary examples of sin and divine judgment. But alongside the warnings was undeniable allure, the image of men and women who dared to defy kings, navies, and empires. The most influential of these early works was Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, first published in 1724. Johnson's book immortalized figures like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonny, and Mary Red, shaping how generations would imagine them. Though Johnson embellished liberally, his portrait became canonical. The Republic of Nassau, fleeting in reality, was enshrined as a republic of words. The fascination spread across Europe. Pirates entered ballads, plays, and stories. They were depicted as ruthless villains, but also as daring adventurers. In the imaginations of audiences far from the Caribbean, piracy became a stage upon which questions of power, freedom, and morality could be explored. Influence on revolutionary thought. Beyond myth, the pirate republic left echoes in political thought. The codes that governed pirate crews, voting for captains, dividing plunder equally, compensating the wounded, were practical, born of necessity. But they also embodied principles of fairness and democracy rare in the early 18th century. Historians debate the extent of their influence, but the parallels are striking. When American colonists later rebelled against Britain, they drew on ideals of consent, equality, and liberty. The notion that authority must rest on the will of the governed, so central to pirate articles, resonated with a revolutionary spirit. Pirates were not philosophers, but their practices foreshadowed arguments that would erupt decades later in the American and French revolutions. Moreover, The inclusivity of pirate crews, where men of different races and nationalities worked side by side, offered a radical contrast to the rigid hierarchies of empire. While limited and often pragmatic, this diversity suggested that identity could be reshaped outside the structures of colonial rule. For some observers, Nassau became a symbol not just of lawlessness but of possibility. The pirate as symbol of rebellion. As empires tightened their grip on the Atlantic, the memory of pirates endured as a counter-image, the outlaw who defied authority. In the centuries that followed, pirates were invoked as symbols of rebellion, sometimes romanticized, sometimes feared. In the 19th century, novelists and playwrights transformed pirates into figures of adventure. Works like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island recast them as swashbuckling rogues, dangerous yet irresistible. The brutal realities of the gallows and gibbets faded, replaced by buried treasure, secret maps, and chests of gold. In the 20th century, film carried the myth further. Hollywood produced countless versions of the pirate tale, from Errol Flynn's charismatic captains to the darker, modern reinterpretations of the 21st century. Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean franchise turned Blackbeard, Calypso, and Jack Sparrow into household names, embedding the pirate archetype into global culture. Even in music, fashion, and politics, the pirate's image endured. The black flag, once a symbol of terror, became a banner of rebellion. Punk bands, hackers, and political activists adopted it as a sign of defiance. Piracy itself became a metaphor for resistance against established order, whether in culture, technology, or politics. Were they villains or visionaries? Yet behind the myth lies the uncomfortable truth. The pirates of Nassau were not liberators or revolutionaries in the ideological sense. They killed, plundered, and terrorized. Their republic was sustained by violence and theft. The freedom they claimed was won at the expense of countless victims. At the same time, the social order they created contained glimpses of radical possibility. They rejected the rigid hierarchies of their age, insisted on equality among themselves, and practiced a form of democracy unknown in monarchic Europe. They demonstrated that ordinary sailors, despised and oppressed in naval service, could govern themselves. The contradictions defined their legacy. They were villains to merchants and governors, rebels to empires, brothers to one another, and visionaries only by accident. Their republic was never sustainable, never destined to last. And yet, in its brief life, it showed that even in an age of kings and empires, men and women could imagine a world beyond them. The enduring question. Centuries later, the pirate republic endures less as a political reality than as a question. What does it mean to be free? Is freedom simply the absence of authority, or does it require justice, stability, and community? Nassau answered with a fragile experiment, proving both the allure and the danger of liberty without law. The dream of the republic died on the gallows, in the executions of Blackbeard, Vane, Rackham, Bonny, and Red. But its legend lived on, in stories, in songs, in revolutions, and in every black flag raised in defiant since. So were they villains, or visionaries ahead of their time? The truth is that they were both, and neither. They were human, desperate, brutal, audacious, and flawed. In their contradictions lies their legacy, a reminder that freedom is as perilous as it is precious, and that even outlaws can shape the imagination of the world.